Welcome back to another heartwarming story that proves how a single act of kindness can echo through the years. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from today, as we share a tale that reminds us why sports are about more than just the game. It was 1995, and the old Chicago Stadium was alive with the familiar sounds of squeaking sneakers and bouncing basketballs. But for 14-year-old David Mitchell, those sounds meant something different than they did to most. They were the soundtrack to his dreams, playing in the background as he went about his duties as one of the youngest ball boys in Chicago Bulls history. David wasn't supposed to be there that day. His father, Mark Mitchell, the stadium's longtime janitor, had fallen ill and couldn't make it to work. David, who often helped his father after school, had convinced his mother Victoria that he could handle his father's basic duties for the evening. What no one knew then was that this simple twist of fate would lead to a moment that would change his life forever. The young teenager moved through the stadium's corridors with practiced ease, pushing his father's cleaning cart, trying to maintain his dad's immaculate standards. His mother was working a double shift at the hospital, trying to keep up with Mark's mounting medical bills. The weight of his family's struggles sat heavy on David's young shoulders, but he never let it show. Even at 14, David understood the value of hard work and dignity. He'd learned it from his father, who, despite being a janitor, carried himself with the pride of his own son. Mark would often say, "It's not about what job you do, it's about how well you do it." Those words echoed in David's mind as he carefully attended to each task, just as his father had taught him. The Bulls were preparing for a crucial playoff game, and the atmosphere in the stadium was electric. David tried to stay invisible, as ball boys were supposed to do, but he couldn't help stealing glances at the players as they went through their pre-game routines. Especially Scottie Pippen, who had always been his favorite player, not just because of his incredible skills, but because of how he carried himself with quiet dignity, much like David's father. What David didn't know was that Scottie Pippen had noticed him too. The NBA superstar had grown used to seeing Mark's familiar face in the corridors, always greeting him with a respectful nod. Today, seeing the man's young son trying to fill his father's shoes had caught his attention. Victoria Mitchell had always taught her son that pride and respect were more important than money. Even as their family struggled to make ends meet, she made sure David understood that character mattered more than circumstances. But on this particular evening, as David worked through his father's duties while trying to maintain his ball boy responsibilities, the weight of their situation felt particularly heavy. The other ball boys came from different backgrounds. Most of them had parents who could afford the latest sneakers, the newest Bulls merchandise. David's shoes were handed down from his cousin, the soles worn thin, held together with carefully placed duct tape that he colored black with a marker so it wouldn't be so obvious. As David went about his duties, he overheard snippets of conversation about his father. The other stadium staff spoke in hushed, concerned tones about Mark's illness, about how dedicated he'd been to his job, never missing a day in 15 years until now. David pretended not to hear, focusing instead on making sure every floor was spotless, every task completed to his father's exacting standards. The pre-game warm-up was in full swing when it happened. David was carefully maneuvering his father's cleaning cart past the Bulls bench, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible, when one of its wheels caught on an uneven part of the floor. The cart tilted precariously, and despite David's best efforts to steady it, several cleaning supplies clattered to the ground. The young teen's face burned with embarrassment as he quickly knelt to gather the scattered items. He could feel eyes on him, expecting the worst, perhaps a scolding from the staff, or worse, being told he couldn't handle his father's responsibilities. But then a pair of hands appeared beside his own, helping to collect the fallen supplies. David looked up to find Scottie Pippen kneeling beside him, calmly helping him recover the scattered items. The NBA star didn't say anything at first, just helped in silence, but David noticed him glancing at his worn-out shoes, taking in the carefully concealed duct tape, the frayed laces. "Your father's Mark, right?" Pippen finally asked, his voice low and kind. "The best janitor this place has ever seen?" David nodded, unable to find his voice, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and anxiety. "He's taught you well," Pippen continued, noting how neatly David had arranged everything back in the cart. "I've seen you working double duty tonight." handling his responsibilities and your ball boy duties. That takes character. Before David could respond, one of the coaches called Pippen back to the court. The basketball star stood, gave David a small nod, and returned to his warm-up routine. The young teen watched him go, that brief interaction already becoming a memory he knew he'd treasure forever. What David didn't realize was that this moment was just the beginning. As he continued his duties that evening, Scottie Pippen kept noticing things, the way the young teen never complained, how he maintained his ball boy responsibilities while also handling his father's duties, the dignity with which he carried himself despite his worn-out shoes and clearly difficult circumstances. The game that night was a thriller, with the Bulls pulling out a crucial playoff victory. David was exhausted but satisfied, knowing he'd managed to maintain his father's high standards while fulfilling his ball boy duties. As the crowds filed out and the players headed to the locker room, he began his final tasks of the evening, looking forward to sharing every detail of the game with his father. But the night wasn't over yet. As David was finishing up, one of the team's staff members approached him with a message that would lead to an encounter he'd never forget. What happened next would not only change that evening but would set in motion a series of events that would resonate through the decades, eventually leading to a reunion that would touch hearts across the nation. The young teen had no way of knowing that his father's old cleaning cart, his worn-out shoes, and his quiet dignity had caught the attention of someone who understood better than most what it meant to rise above difficult circumstances. Scottie Pippen had seen something of himself in this young ball boy, something that reminded him of his own humble beginnings and the power of perseverance. As the arena emptied and the cleaning crews began their nightly routine, David Mitchell was approached by one of the team's staff members. "Hey kid," the man called out, "Scottie wants to see you in the locker room before you leave." David's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing through everything he'd done that evening, wondering if he'd made some mistake in his duties. The Bulls' locker room was nearly empty when David arrived, most players having already left for the night. Scottie Pippen sat at his locker, still in his game uniform, a large shoebox resting beside him. The NBA star looked up as David entered, offering a warm smile that immediately put the nervous teenager at ease. "Come here for a minute," Pippen called out, gesturing to the space next to him. As David approached, he couldn't help but notice how his worn-out shoes seemed even shabbier in the bright locker room lights. But there was something in Pippen's demeanor that made him stand a little straighter, remembering his father's words about carrying yourself with dignity regardless of circumstances. "You know," Pippen began, his voice thoughtful, "when I was growing up in Hamburg, Arkansas, my father couldn't work anymore after suffering a stroke. Times were tough. Really tough." He picked up the shoebox beside him, turning it over in his hands. "I was the youngest of 12 kids and new shoes? That was like asking for the moon." David listened intently, hardly daring to breathe. He'd never heard Scottie Pippen talk about his background like this before. The basketball star continued, "But there was this one guy, my high school basketball coach. He saw something in me, saw how hard I was working despite everything. One day, he gave me a pair of proper basketball shoes. Not because I asked for them, but because he noticed I needed them." Pippen opened the box, revealing a pair of his signature Nike shoes, pristine and new. "Sometimes," he said, "all it takes is one person to notice, to understand. I saw you out there tonight, David, doing your father's job, doing your ball boy duties, never complaining, keeping your head high. That takes something special." David's eyes widened as Pippen handed him the box. "These aren't just any shoes," the NBA star explained. "They're the exact same ones I wore tonight. I've signed them, but more importantly, I want you to remember something when you wear them. Where you start doesn't determine where you'll end up. It's what you do along the way that matters." With trembling hands, David accepted the box. Inside, along with the shoes, was a handwritten note that he would treasure for years to come. But what made the moment even more special was what Pippen said next. "Your father, Mark, he's one of the most respected people in this building. Every night for 15 years, he's kept this place running smoothly, with dignity and pride. Now I see his son, stepping up when things are tough, carrying that same dignity. That's what real character looks like." Tears welled up in David's eyes, but he blinked them back, just as his father had taught him. Men in their family didn't cry, they stood tall, they worked hard, and they faced whatever came their way with strength and grace. "Thank you, Mr. Pippen," David managed to say, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "My dad, he always says you're the kind of player who makes everyone around him better. Now I understand what he means." Pippen smiled, reaching out to squeeze David's shoulder. "You tell your father something for me. Tell him the Bulls family takes care of its own. And both of you, your family." What David didn't know then was that Scottie Pippen had already spoken to the team's management about Mark's situation. The next day, the Mitchell family would receive a call about an anonymous donation that would cover all of Mark's medical expenses. But that's another story, one that would only come to light years later. For now, David carefully placed the shoes back in their box, knowing that this moment was about more than just a pair of signed sneakers. It was about being seen, being valued, and being reminded that hard work and dignity never go unnoticed, even if it sometimes feels that way. As David left the locker room that night, carrying both the shoe box and his father's cleaning supplies, he walked a little taller. The shoes would become his most prized possession, not because they were valuable or signed by a basketball star, but because they represented a moment when someone like Scottie Pippen had recognized in him the same values his parents had worked so hard to instill. Victoria Mitchell was waiting in her car outside the stadium when David emerged, having finished her double shift at the hospital. She noticed immediately that something was different about her son's bearing, the way he carried himself as he approached the car. When David showed her the shoes and recounted his conversation with Pippen, she didn't say much, but her eyes filled with tears of pride and gratitude. That night, as David sat by his father's bedside, carefully showing him the shoes and relaying Pippen's message, Mark Mitchell managed a weak smile. "See, son," he whispered, his voice hoarse but proud. "That's why we do things the right way, even when nobody's watching. Because sometimes, somebody is watching. And sometimes, that somebody understands." The shoes would take a place of honor in David's room, not to be worn but to serve as a daily reminder of that pivotal evening. They would witness his high school graduation, his college acceptance, and eventually, his own career path. But more importantly, they would remind him daily of the lessons learned on that spring evening in 1995, about dignity, about perseverance, and about the power of kindness to change lives. Little did anyone know that these shoes would become more than just a cherished memory. They would eventually lead to a reunion that would touch hearts across the nation, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures can create ripples that extend far beyond their original moment. As David drifted off to sleep that night, his father's words echoing in his mind and Pippen's shoes safely stored in their box, he couldn't have known that this was just the beginning of a story that would span decades. A story about more than basketball, more than shoes, more than even kindness itself. A story about how the simplest actions can sometimes lead to the most extraordinary connections. Years would pass, lives would change, and that old Chicago stadium would eventually give way to the United Center. But the impact of that evening, of that simple act of kindness from an NBA superstar who saw something special in a hardworking young ball boy, would continue to resonate in ways that nobody could have predicted. And somewhere in Chicago, a pair of signed basketball shoes sat in their box, waiting for the day when their story would come full circle, when a chance reunion would remind everyone about the lasting power of compassion, recognition, and respect. 28 years can change many things, but some memories remain as fresh as the day they were made. For David Mitchell, now a successful youth basketball coach and community organizer in Chicago's South Side, those Nike shoes in their well-preserved box remained a constant reminder of the night that changed his life's trajectory. The years following that memorable evening in 1995 had brought both triumphs and challenges for the Mitchell family. Mark Mitchell had eventually recovered enough to return to work, thanks in large part to the mysterious anonymous donation that covered his medical bills. He worked at the Chicago Stadium until its closure, and then transferred to the United Center, where he continued his duties until his retirement in 2010. Victoria Mitchell had been able to reduce her working hours at the hospital, allowing her to spend more time with her family. She never forgot how Scottie Pippen's gesture had given her son something more valuable than just shoes. It had given him confidence, validation, and a powerful example of how to treat others. David had worn those shoes exactly once, to his high school graduation. The rest of the time, they remained carefully preserved, a testament to the power of kindness and recognition. He'd gone on to college on a partial academic scholarship, supplemented by his continued work as a ball boy at the United Center. Those early lessons about dignity and hard work had served him well. Now, in 2023, David ran a youth basketball program that focused on more than just sports. He taught his players the same values he'd learned from his father and from that brief but powerful interaction with Scottie Pippen: dignity, perseverance, and the importance of lifting others up. The shoes sat in his office, a constant reminder of why he did what he did. "You see these shoes?" he would often tell his young players, some of whom came from circumstances even more challenging than his own had been. "They're not special because they're signed by Scottie Pippen. They're special because of what they represent. Someone taking the time to see another person struggle and responding with kindness." One autumn morning in 2023, as David was preparing for another day of coaching, his phone buzzed with a notification. A former Bulls staff member had posted an old photo on social media, a group shot from the 1995 season that included the Ball Boys. There, in the corner of the image, was a 14-year-old David, standing proud in his ball boy uniform. The comments section quickly filled with memories from that era, and David found himself sharing the story of the shoes. He hadn't told it publicly before, always keeping it as a personal reminder of the power of kindness. But something prompted him to share it now, typing out the tale of how an NBA superstar had noticed a struggling young ball boy and changed his life with a simple gesture. The post quickly gained traction, spreading through basketball social media circles. Former Bulls staff members added their own memories of Mark Mitchell's dedication as a janitor and his son's determination to fill in for him that night. The story resonated with people, touching something universal about the impact one person's kindness can have on another's life. What David didn't know was that the post had caught the attention of someone special. Through a series of shares and retweets, it had made its way to Scottie Pippen himself. The NBA legend had never forgotten that evening either, though he'd done many kind things throughout his career. There was something about that particular night, about that determined young ball boy doing his father's job with such dignity, that had stuck with him. As David's story spread online, more details emerged. Other former ball boys from that era shared their memories of the Mitchell family. The mysterious medical bill donation was finally traced back to its source. Pippen had quietly arranged it through the Bulls' community outreach program, never wanting recognition for the gesture. Victoria Mitchell, now retired herself, saw the social media buzz and finally shared a detail she'd kept quiet all these years. The night David had received the shoes, she'd written a letter to Scottie Pippen, thanking him not just for the gift, but for seeing her son's worth and reinforcing the values she and Mark had worked so hard to instill. She'd never mailed it, feeling that sometimes gratitude is best held in the heart. The story continued to spread, touching people across the country. It wasn't just about basketball or celebrity kindness, it was about the ripple effects of simple human recognition. David's youth program began receiving calls from parents who wanted their children to learn the values he taught, not just basketball skills. Then came the message that would lead to an extraordinary reunion. The Bulls' community relations department reached out to David with an invitation that would bring his story full circle. They wanted him to be part of a special ceremony, though they were deliberately vague about the details. David's players urged him to accept, excited for their coach but also sensing that this was about something bigger than basketball. His mother found that unmailed thank you letter, preserved in a family album for almost 3 decades. And in his office, those shoes in their box seemed to carry even more meaning than before. What no one knew yet was that Scottie Pippen had his own memories of that night, his own reasons for wanting to reconnect with the ball boy who had shown such character in a difficult moment. The NBA legend had followed David's work with youth basketball from afar, seeing how that one act of kindness had multiplied into thousands of similar acts through David's commitment to his community. As the day of the ceremony approached, David found himself reflecting on all the years between that night in 1995 and now. He thought about his father, who had passed away in 2015, and how proud Mark Mitchell had been to see his son carry forward the lessons about dignity and hard work that he'd taught him. He thought about his mother, who had sacrificed so much to keep their family going during tough times. And he thought about those shoes sitting in their box in his office. They had become more than just a piece of memorabilia. They were a symbol of how one person's kindness could change the course of another's life. Not just through the gift itself, but through the message it carried, that hard work doesn't go unnoticed, that dignity matters, and that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. What was about to happen at the United Center would prove that some stories don't end, they just keep adding new chapters. The reunion that was about to take place would show that the real power of kindness lies not in the initial act, but in how it continues to ripple outward, touching life after life, year after year. The shoes that had sat in their box for 28 years were about to play one more role in this ongoing story of recognition, respect, and the extraordinary impact of ordinary kindness. And Scottie Pippen, the NBA legend who had once noticed a struggling young ball boy, was about to demonstrate that sometimes the greatest assists happen off the basketball court. The United Center was buzzing with energy, but it wasn't a game night. Instead, the arena was hosting a special community event celebrating the impact of basketball on Chicago's youth. David Mitchell stood in the tunnel leading to the court, that same shoebox from 1995 tucked carefully under his arm. His mother Victoria sat in the front row, that unmailed thank you letter in her purse, her eyes already glistening with anticipation. What David didn't know was that this wasn't just any community event. The Bulls organization had worked closely with Scottie Pippen to create something special, a moment that would bring this story of kindness full circle. In the opposite tunnel, the NBA legend waited, remembering that night from nearly 3 decades ago. The event began with a celebration of community basketball programs, highlighting the work being done across Chicago to help young people through sports. David's program was featured prominently, with videos of his players talking about the lessons they'd learned, not just about basketball, but about dignity, perseverance, and the importance of lifting others up. Coach Mitchell always tells us that it's not about where you start, one young player said in the video. It's about how you carry yourself along the way. The words echoed those Scottie Pippen had spoken to a young ball boy 28 years earlier, though the player couldn't have known that. As David watched the tributes to various community programs, he felt a tap on his shoulder. A staff member gestured for him to follow, leading him toward center court. The lights in the arena dimmed, and a spotlight illuminated the space where he stood. Then a familiar voice echoed through the speakers. In 1995, I met a young ball boy who taught me something about character. Scottie Pippen's voice filled the arena. He was doing his father's job as a janitor while keeping up with his ball boy duties, never complaining, carrying himself with dignity despite difficult circumstances. David's heart raced as he realized what was happening. The spotlight widened, and there was Scottie Pippen, walking onto the court, looking barely changed by the years. The NBA legend carried something in his hands, a basketball shoe, but not just any shoe. It was the mate to one of the pairs he'd given away that night in 1995. I kept this all these years, Pippen said, now standing face to face with David, because that night reminded me of something important. It reminded me of where I came from, of all the people who helped me along the way, and of how a simple act of recognition can change a life. Victoria Mitchell wiped tears from her eyes as she watched her son shake hands with the NBA star who had played such a pivotal role in their family's story. When she reached into her purse and pulled out that decades-old letter, Pippen's eyes softened with recognition. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, addressing her in the crowd, "you never mailed that letter, but your gratitude was felt. The way your son has lived his life, the work he's done with young people in this community, that's been all the thank you anyone could ask for." David opened the shoebox he'd carried with him, revealing the perfectly preserved shoes from that night in 1995. The crowd gasped as they realized what they were seeing, a piece of basketball history, but more importantly, a symbol of how one act of kindness could echo through decades. "These shoes," David said, his voice steady despite his emotion, "they've been more than just memorabilia. They've been a daily reminder of what it means to see someone, to recognize their struggle, and to respond with kindness. Every time I work with my players, I try to do for them what you did for me that night. Show them that someone notices their efforts, their dignity, their worth." Pippen smiled, gesturing to the stadium screens where photos began to appear, images of David's youth basketball program, of kids learning and growing, of communities coming together. "You've taken that one moment and multiplied it 1,000 times over," the NBA legend said. "Every kid you've coached, every life you've touched, that's the real legacy of that night." The event had one more surprise in store. The Bulls organization announced the creation of the Mitchell Family Youth Basketball Initiative, a program that would provide resources and support to community basketball programs across Chicago. The seed money for the initiative came from an anonymous donor, though the knowing smile on Pippen's face left little doubt about its source. As David and Scottie stood center court, the NBA legend had one more thing to share. "You know, I've given away a lot of shoes over my career," he said, "but I've never seen a pair make quite the impact these did." It was never about the shoes, though, was it? It was about someone taking the time to notice, to care, to show a young person that their dignity and hard work mattered. Victoria Mitchell finally stood and approached center court, that unmailed letter in her hands. As she read it aloud, her voice carried the weight of 28 years of gratitude. The letter spoke not just of thanks for the shoes, but for the hope they represented, for the validation they offered a young boy doing his best to help his family through difficult times. The ceremony concluded with David's current players joining them on court, each carrying a new pair of basketball shoes, not as a gift, but as a symbol of their commitment to carry forward the lessons they'd learned about dignity, perseverance, and the power of kindness. Sometimes, Scottie Pippen addressed the crowd one final time, "The biggest assists we make in life happen off the basketball court." David Mitchell took a simple gesture and turned it into a lifetime of giving back. That's what real legacy looks like. As the event wound down, David and Scottie spent time talking quietly, sharing stories about the years between then and now. They talked about Mark Mitchell and his legacy of dignity and hard work, about Victoria's sacrifices, and about all the young lives being changed through basketball and compassion. The shoes from 1995 would find a new home, not in a box in David's office, but in a special display at the United Center, alongside the letter Victoria never mailed. Together, they would stand as a testament to the lasting power of kindness and recognition, inspiring future generations to understand that sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. Before they parted, Scottie Pippen had one last thing to say to David. "You know, back then, I thought I was just helping out a hardworking kid. But you've shown me that when you recognize someone's worth, when you validate their struggle and their dignity, you're not just changing their life, you're touching every life they'll go on to touch." David looked around at his players, at his mother, at the community that had gathered to celebrate this moment. "That's the real power of kindness," he replied. "It never stays small. It grows, it spreads, and it changes lives in ways we could never predict." Has someone's kindness ever changed your life? Share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest ripples, touching lives for generations to come. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the extraordinary impact of ordinary kindness.